Okay, welcome back everyone to Grockit's OGTV. This is the GMAT edition, as I mention at the top of every broadcast, so that you know you're tuned into the right thing. We're going through the 12th edition to the guide to the test, like it says there on the bottom of the screen. And my name's Jim Jacobson, like it says in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And you're on Grockit.com. We're going through the 12th edition to the official guide to the test. That's the one with the purple cover and the kind of gold-colored letters. And we're going question to question, cover to cover through the whole thing. Right now, today, we are starting the critical reasoning section. So this is our first broadcast in the critical reasoning session. So I want to give a little bit of background on critical reasoning strategy, and of course the details and finer points of strategy we'll be covering as we go through the questions. But there's some overarching stuff that you should know before you tackle critical reasoning questions. The big one overall is just to know how arguments are structured. Oh, let's turn that a little bit. Argument structure. Overall, arguments in the critical reasoning section are constructed in this way. They're basically very similar to an equation. The evidence plus the assumptions, and there will be many assumptions, but there's usually one central one that's maybe a little bit more of a logical leap and something that is a key element of the evidence, so assumptions. Those two things equal the conclusion. And another way to think about the assumption is as unstated evidence. It's something that the author believes is part of the argument. The author is assuming that the reader will consider that also or make the same logical step. And it is a key element of the conclusion. In fact, one of the strategies that you can employ in the question types that require you to do something to the underlying assumption. So there are, of course, critical reasoning questions that ask you to identify the central assumption. Much more commonly, you'll be asked to strengthen or weaken that underlying assumption. And in addition, there are some shortcuts to certain other question types that involve the assumption. In any case, one of the ways to get a hint as to what that central assumption is to look for terms, ideas, words, shifts in meaning or focus that occur in the conclusion. I should probably do this. So it won't be in the evidence. The evidence will be this, and then the conclusion will have this and this. And so your hint is that the assumption includes whatever that is. These are just symbols. Don't read too much into a line versus an X. So very often there will be a shift in meaning or a change in terminology or an additional idea that appears in the conclusion that gives you a hint about what the author's underlying assumptions are. And I think we have at least one of those today, where identifying the conclusion and looking for shifts like that can actually help you identify the assumption. So that's a big element. And in your own analysis of critical reasoning questions, if you're very new to critical reasoning, when you do some untimed practice on your own, that is to say, doing these things without a clock running, I'm a firm believer in learning how to do things correctly with infinite time, as well as doing it in a timed environment. You should never do just one or the other when you're new to something, because you need to learn what it feels like to do it correctly, and to get into develop good habits and then develop speed. So one thing to do on your own, and in terms of analyzing arguments that are unfamiliar, is to first identify that conclusion. Which part of the sentence or passage, the short passage, is the conclusion? It can appear anywhere. It could be the first sentence. It could be the last sentence. It could be somewhere in the middle. Very often it will be signaled with words like, thus, or therefore, or in conclusion, but it won't always be. Typically then, the rest of the passage, aside from whatever part is the conclusion, will be that evidence. And so it's usually less difficult to identify the evidence once you've chosen the conclusion. And then from there you can start tackling what the underlying assumptions are. Note that inference questions may not necessarily be constructed the same way, which brings us to the next big issue to cover before before we actually just get started with the questions. I don't want to go on too long about this because I do want to cover some valuable questions in today's session. But the big question here is whether you should read the question first. And for a long time, and I've been doing test prep for, well, I first started in 2000, so I've been doing this for a while. The way we were taught to tell people, or the way we were taught to teach people, was to tell people to read the question first. If you read the actual question rather than the passage, you get an idea of what your task is going to be, so that if you know in advance that you're going to need to weaken the argument, you can know that as you're reading through it and look for things that might weaken it as you go. The place that I think this matters particularly are the few instances where there are shortcuts available, because there are some on some types of questions, and also inference questions are typically structured differently, and there's sort of less that you can do. It changes the nature of the passage, and your task is very different. You're not necessarily looking for the underlying assumption at all to do anything with it. So reading the question first can affect your ability to look for clues on your first read through. And so for that reason, many people advocate reading the question first. Over time, though, and as I've worked with more and more people who really struggle with critical reasoning, or for people whose native language is not English, I've started to see the value in the other approach as well. So this is not instead of, this is not to convince you not to read the question first. But just as with reading comprehension, where there's huge value in reading comprehension, in reading the passage thoroughly and understanding it first before you even look at the first question, the one that's sitting in the other column on the screen, there is likewise value in doing that in critical reasoning. That is to say, concentrate on the passage, concentrate your full attention on understanding the passage, then look at the question and skim back to the part where for the parts that are relevant to whatever the question asks. I would say that the time savings either way, let's just assume that one or the other of these works better for you. Time savings, I think, are probably minimal, even over the course of the entire test. The bigger question is accuracy, and that's really something that only you can determine which one works better for you. Do some tests where you do 10 questions where you read the passage first, and then do 10 questions where you read the question first, and see which one produces a higher degree of accuracy. It may require several tests, and you may not determine that one is necessarily better than the other. It is usually to your advantage, though, to have the same approach for every question, and so whatever you do decide to do, just get in the habit of doing that, and the whole thing will become more routine. I think what I will probably be doing with this broadcast, unless someone really talks me out of it in the Facebook comments or something like that, is I will probably read the passage first, and that's really just more a matter of convenience. That's the order that they appear in the book, and so I can just read through them that way. It does also allow us to do that, concentrating on the passage first thing. So anyway, your mileage may vary, and perhaps later on, partway through, I'll shift gears and read the question first. But I've really started to see the value in working with lots of students in really understanding the passage well the first time.